Camp Hearne, Texas, July 1944. The corrugated metal roof amplified the heat into something almost solid, pressing down on the compound like the hand of an angry god. But it was a sound that struck Werner Hoffmann first as the guards escorted his group through the gates. Not sirens or shouts, but the ordinary hum of a functioning place. Men calling to each other in German. The smell of cooking that carried more complexity than anything he'd encountered in 2 years of warfare. Werner was 23, though photographed from before the North African campaign would have shown a different person entirely. The one in his mother's apartment in Stuttgart had been rosy-cheeked, proud in his new uniform, convinced of the righteousness of his cause. The man shuffling across the Texas dust now was something else entirely. His uniform hung from him like borrowed clothes. His eyes had learned to calculate calories from a distance. His hands trembled not from fear but from the accumulated weight of hunger that had become his defining characteristic, etched into his skeleton like a record of every month of deprivation. He had been captured at Kasserine Pass when American tanks had pawed through the line with a mechanical inevitability that suggested this war, his war, was fundamentally already over. The realization had come as both relief and betrayal. Relief because the fighting was finished. Betrayal because it meant admitting that everyone who had died, the men in his unit, friend from training, the conscripted boy from Cologne who had frozen in the winter campaign, had died for nothing, or worse, for something that had been doomed from the beginning. The other prisoners had talked about America constantly, speculation filling the void where certainty used to live. Some said the camps were brutal, death marches dressed up as relocation. Others had heard different stories, whispered accounts of places where Germans were treated as human beings rather than conquered enemies. Werner had learned not to believe anything anyone said. Belief was a luxury for men whose circumstances were stable enough to support hope. He had learned to focus on immediate survival. Food, water, shelter, temperature, everything else was irrelevant. The journey across the Atlantic had been worse than the fighting because at least in combat there was a possibility of action, of resistance, of agency. On the ship, pressed into the hold with 800 other men, agency disappeared entirely. You breathed the air that was allocated. You ate the rations that were distributed. You tried not to think about the submarines that occasionally reminded you of their presence through the vibration that traveled through the hull. Some men had died during that crossing, though the guards never explained of what. Dysentery, pneumonia, the simple giving up that could overtake a body as completely as any bullet. By the time the transport reached Galveston, Werner had stopped counting days. Time had become a different measurement, marked not by calendars but by the ratio between hunger and the quantity of food made available to address it. On this scale, the months since capture had been an eternity. The camp commander was a colonel with a face like weathered oak and a surprising informality. He had addressed the new arrival through an interpreter, explaining the rules in German. The Geneva Convention would be observed. Men would be treated fairly. Work assignments would be given to those capable of working. Medical attention would be provided for the sick. Education programs would be available for those interested in improvement. It sounded improbable, like propaganda designed for men too desperate to think clearly. Werner had heard that Americans were cunning, that they would make promises to extract cooperation before revealing the true brutality of captivity. The barracks assigned to him were clean, which surprised him. The bunks had actual mattresses with straw, not bare wood or dirt. The roof didn't leak. There were windows that could be opened for air circulation. Around him, other prisoners moved with the careful efficiency of men adjusting to a new hierarchy, claiming territories in the spaces assigned to them, establishing the invisible social boundaries that would define their existence here. An older prisoner, perhaps 40, with the bearing of a career soldier, introduced himself as Hauptmann Müller, though the rank seemed to matter less here than it once had. Müller had been in camps before, had survived the earlier waves of capture, had knowledge that carried value in a place where information was currency. First time. Müller asked, eyeing Werner with the assessing gaze of someone calculating whether the newcomer would likely survive the transition. Yes, Werner said simply. Your first concern is food adjustment, Müller said, sitting on an adjacent bunk. Don't expect to understand what's happening here for at least a week. Your mind can't process it yet because you've been running on a deficit for so long. The abundance will feel like a trick because abundance hasn't existed in your world for years. Werner wanted to ask questions but lacked the energy for sustained conversation. Müller seemed to understand this and said nothing else, simply lying back on his bunk and closing his eyes as if the conversation had never occurred. Dinner was announced by a bell that rang across the compound with purposeful clarity. They formed lines, supervised but not crowded, and moved toward the main mess hall. The building was larger than Werner expected, and cooler inside than the Texas heat suggested possible. Industrial fans turned lazily from the ceiling. Long tables stretched in neat rows, their surfaces clean, already set with utensils and glasses of water. The serving line was where the impossible began. Werner stepped forward when his turn came, holding the metal tray he'd been issued, and stared at what was displayed on the serving tables. His mind struggled to process the quantity and variety. There was roasted chicken, entire pieces, not soup made from bones. There were white beans in what appeared to be butter. There were string beans, fresh, cooked with salt and something that smelled of garlic. There was bread, wheat bread, golden and soft, stacked in a basket that the server replenished even as Werner watched. There were bowls of fruit, canned peaches in syrup, apples, berries in cream. An American soldier who managed the serving line wore sergeant stripes and had a German name sewn into his uniform, Reinhard. He looked at Werner with the specific compassion of someone who recognized the expression on the newcomer's face. "Go ahead," Sergeant Reinhardt said in barely accented German. "Take what you want. There's plenty. We eat this way every day. You'll get used to it, though the first few meals might make you sick. That's normal. Your stomach needs time to remember what food actually is." Werner moved down the line in something like a dream state. Reinhardt loaded his tray with chicken. Another soldier added beans. A third placed 2 slices of bread, still warm, beside everything else. At the end, someone poured iced tea into a glass, and it occurred to Werner that he had not tasted anything cold and sweet since before North Africa. He found a seat at one of the tables, aware that Mueller had somehow appeared beside him, settling with the ease of someone for whom the scene was routine rather than revolutionary. Around them, the mess hall filled with prisoners eating with varying degrees of control. Some ate slowly, respectfully, as if aware they were witnessing something they didn't fully understand. Others ate with the desperate speed of men still afraid the food might vanish. The sound was the clinking of utensils, the murmur of conversation, the occasional laugh. The ordinary sounds of men who had discovered that captivity didn't mean starvation. Werner cut a piece of chicken. It was real chicken, not stretched with fillers or boiled until it was a textured memory of meat. The meat was tender, seasoned with salt and something he couldn't identify, but that made his mouth water before he'd even tasted it. He placed the piece in his mouth and chewed slowly, aware that Mueller was watching with the attention of a man monitoring an experiment. The flavor was almost overwhelming. His body recognized the protein, the fat, the nutrients his system had been denied for so long. For a moment, he couldn't continue. He had to set his fork down and breathe through the sudden rush of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. Men didn't cry in the presence of other prisoners. Men maintained dignity. But dignity seemed like a small price for what was sitting on his plate. "Breathe," Mueller said quietly. "Slow. You'll make yourself sick if you eat too fast." Werner nodded, picked up the glass of iced tea, and drank it slowly. The cold liquid slid down his throat like luxury. He had forgotten that things could be cold, that temperature could be a variable of pleasure rather than just survival. The beans were cooked with a butter he could taste, and actual garlic, not the powdered substitute that had become normal. The bread had been heated enough that the butter melted into it, and the combination of wheat and fat seemed almost indulgent in its simplicity. "How long have you been here?" Werner asked Mueller between careful bites. 6 months, Mueller said, "captured in Sicily." "And this is normal?" Mueller gestured around the mess hall with his fork. "This is what they serve to us. The American soldiers eat the same thing. According to Geneva Convention, prisoners receive the same rations as enlisted men at the base. They take that seriously. Unlike the Germans, they don't use a convention as a reference point to parse how little they can provide. They use it as a minimum standard and aim higher." The word should have made sense, but Werner's mind couldn't quite construct the philosophy of captivity they described. In German camps, the focus was on control, on establishing hierarchy, on the assertion of power through scarcity. The idea of an occupying force feeding its prisoners with generosity seemed not just improbable, but fundamentally incomprehensible. He made it through half his plate before his stomach signaled that it could accept no more. Around him, prisoners pushed back from tables, some obviously full, some carrying partially eaten portions of what he assumed was a waste disposal area. The casual abandonment of food seemed to confirm what his mind had begun to suspect, that plenty was a baseline here, not an aberration. Your body will adapt, Mueller said, noticing Werner's discomfort. By the third or fourth meal, you'll be able to handle more. By the end of the first week, you'll wonder how you ever survived on less. By the end of the month, you'll gain weight you thought you'd lost forever. Sergeant Reinhardt passed their table, refilling water glasses with the attentiveness of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. Try to rest this afternoon, he said to Werner in his German-accented English. Sometimes the adjustment hits harder once you've eaten. Tomorrow, breakfast will be just as good, and your stomach will be ready for more of it. The days that followed developed a structure that Werner began to understand as the underlying logic of Camp Hearne. Breakfast consisted of eggs, bacon, toast, fresh fruit, and coffee or milk. Lunch was a hot meal. Sandwiches with real meat, canned vegetables, fresh bread, pie, or cake on certain days. Dinner offered variety. Beef stew, fried pork, baked fish, chicken, roasted vegetables, always accompanied by bread and fresh milk. In between meals, work assignments. Werner was assigned a maintenance crew, physical labor that kept him occupied but not exhausted. The American supervisor was a private named Jackson, a thin man with an Oklahoma accent and the manner of someone who treated Germans as fellow human beings rather than conquered enemies. You're too weak for heavy work right now, Jackson said, explaining Werner's assignment. Give yourself a couple weeks of proper eating, and we'll get you doing the heavier jobs. For now, help Hoffmann with the repairs on the administrative building. It's hot work, but it's not dangerous, and you'll learn something about how things get done here. There were other prisoners, men like Mueller and others with longer histories of captivity, who had adapted to Camp Hearne with a resignation that seemed less like defeat and more like acknowledgement of a new reality. They talked about the quality of treatment compared to other camps they'd heard about, compare it even to what they'd experienced in German military service. One man, a corporal named Dieter who had been captured in Italy, told Werner about a camp in Oklahoma where the conditions were apparently even better. Prisoners were allowed to attend the local high school during the day, to participate in athletic competitions, to receive packages from German relief organizations. The American ideology, Dieter explained, sitting on his bunk after dinner one evening, is that prisoners are criminals, not soldiers. Even an enemy soldier, if he's a prisoner, deserves a certain standard of treatment. It's part of their belief system. Makes them different from us. Better, maybe, depending on your perspective. Werner didn't respond immediately. He was learning that most of his preconceptions had been wrong in ways that were difficult to articulate. The propaganda had spoken of American weakness, of a nation that couldn't sustain war, of a decadent culture that had lost the discipline necessary for victory. But nothing about this camp suggested weakness. The infrastructure was well built. The organization was efficient. The food supply was reliable. The guards were professional without being cruel. More troubling was what this implied about Germany. If America could feed its enemies this well while sustaining a war across two oceans, what did that suggest about the calculation of likely outcomes? What did it mean that Germany, which had conquered much of Europe and had access to the resources of a dozen nations, could not feed its own soldiers adequately? What did it mean that prisoners of war in America received rations that would be luxuries in German cities? 3 weeks into his captivity at Camp Hearne, Werner had gained 12 pounds. His ribs were no longer visible beneath his skin. The hollow in his cheeks had begun to fill. His hands no longer shook when he lifted things. His mind, fed properly for the first time in years, had begun to consider thoughts beyond immediate survival. On a July evening, standing with Mueller on the wooden walkway between barracks, looking out across the Texas landscape at the enormous sky, Werner finally articulated what had been slowly congealing in his understanding since that first meal. "We can't win," he said quietly. "Can we?" Mueller didn't respond immediately. When he did speak, his voice carried the weight of months of the same realization. "No," Mueller said simply. We can't. Not if this is what the enemy can afford to do for prisoners. Not if they have this much abundance while we're counting calories at home. The regime told us we were fighting for survival, for the future of our people. But we were fighting for something that was already doomed. And everyone knew it. Everyone. They just kept fighting anyway, because stopping was unthinkable. Werner thought about his mother in Stuttgart, about the ration cards that grew smaller with each passing month, about neighbor sons who never came home. He thought about the boy from Cologne who had frozen in the winter campaign. He thought about all the dead who had died for a cause that had been impossible from the beginning. What happens when this is over? He asked. When the war ends? Mueller shrugged. We stay here, probably. We get repatriated eventually, or we work. Some camps have education programs, opportunities to learn trades. It depends on how the war ends and what the Americans decide to do with us. But whatever happens, we'll have been treated better than we deserved, given the alternatives. The thought should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Kindness extended to an enemy soldier was harder to bear than cruelty would have been. Cruelty could be resented, could motivate survival instinct, could justify continuing to believe in the righteousness of one side. But kindness stripped away all the comfortable narratives. It made the choices that had led to this moment more difficult to justify. It made the future uncertainty more profound. That night, Werner wrote a letter to his mother that he knew would be censored before it left the camp. He wrote about the camp, about the food, about the treatment he was receiving. He wrote carefully, knowing that any statement could be interpreted as either propaganda or betrayal. But he wanted her to know that he was alive, that he was being fed, that he was as safe as any prisoner of war could be in the middle of Texas, while his nation fought to the bitter end. He didn't tell her that he'd stopped believing in victory. She would learn that eventually, if she survived the war, if Germany survived it, if anything of the world he'd known survived what was coming. In the mess hall the next morning, eating fresh eggs and bacon and toast with butter, Werner realized that Mueller had been right about adaptation. His body had adjusted. He was no longer in shock at the abundance. This was becoming normal. The extraordinary had transformed into the everyday through the simple process of repetition and time. And perhaps that was the most devastating truth of all. That captivity could become comfortable. That the enemy could feed you well enough that you stop quite resenting your captivity. That abundance could become so ordinary that you forgot what hunger felt like. That a man could begin to wonder if surviving the war in an American camp might be preferable to surviving it in any other way. This realization didn't bring comfort. It brought only the slow, steady accumulation of understanding that the world he'd been fighting for had never existed, and the world he was inhabiting now, regardless of its kindness, would never be the world he'd known before.